Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. If I can start by introducing myself. Christine McCormick. I'm the Senior Humanitarian Advisor for Children in Armed Conflict for Save the Children. Thank you very much for inviting Save the Children and myself to participate in this very interesting Congress. And thank you also very much for allowing us to submit something in English and for me to speak in English. I'm afraid my Spanish is poor. We were asked to write about what we as Save the Children are doing on child recruitment and use of children. If I can just start by saying that we don't, unlike Plan and UNICEF, we do very little specific programming solely for girls. We have an integrated approach, making sure that we have a gender sensitive lens to our programming. Oops, is that? Oh, yeah, I think that's right. Okay, so Save the Children has been working to address recruitment and use of girls and boys in conflict settings for over 30 years. Through its programming, through its advocacy work, and through, most recently, a lot of the accountability work that we do. And there's a map of most of the countries where we are doing programming at the moment. There might be one or two that haven't made it onto that map. That's mainly my IT ability showing there. As you'll hear in the presentation, there's a lot of programming that we do, and it's very complementary to what we've already heard from Sylvia and from our colleague at UNICEF. This complementarity is very important. In addition to the programming, or to support the programming, we are part of this coordination mechanism. Sylvia mentioned them, UNICEF has mentioned them at a national and at a regional and global level. And you'll hear reference to those coordination bodies. The Child Protection Subcluster, for example. We participate in the Global Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Settings with the CAFAG Task Force that Sylvia mentioned, and also this global initiative that is being led by UNICEF on child reintegration. In addition to the programming work, we also do a lot of work on advocacy and accountability. And I hope that a little later we will hear from a colleague from Watchlist based in New York. We do a lot of work with them to advocate to states and to the UN and to the international community to address grave violations such as recruitment and use of boys and girls, and making sure that there is a good gender sensitive approach to addressing those violations and respecting child rights, really emphasising the importance of girls' rights. We also co-chair the Paris Principles Steering Group with UNICEF, and this is a key interagency body that looks at the endorsement and implementation of the Paris Principles and commitments that are a key normative tool to address recruitment use of girls and boys. And there are specific articles within the Paris Principles that focus and call attention on making sure that the specific needs of girls are met. So within what we are presenting today in the paper that we have been asked to prepare, we're going to be drawing on our experience, our programming experience, but also what we're doing in our programming and advocacy. Just to note that I will be referring to particular geographic regions, so particularly West Africa, particularly the Middle East and Asia. I'm not going to mention any specific programs or countries, solely because in several of the countries that we work in, if we are talking publicly about the work that we're doing to address child recruitment and other grave violations, it poses a significant risk to my colleagues and also to children and communities. We can advocate privately, but we cannot speak publicly about some of the work that we do in some countries. So I'm just going to talk about the regions here. Oops, the wrong way. Right, great. So a key sort of approach that we have within Save the Children to address child recruitment, but also other grave violations and also other serious child rights violations, is our centrality of protection policy. This is something that we developed about 4 years ago now, and it's really emphasising, you know, what should we be doing as an organisation, but what should we also be promoting with other humanitarian actors and to donors, to governments, etc. What can we be doing through the whole of our work to support the protection of girls and boys, particularly in conflict settings, but also thinking more widely in humanitarian settings as well. And this is a key framework for us, and you can see the main elements here. We have, you know, monitoring, reporting of child recruitment and other grave violations and other serious violations is really quite a key activity for us. It really informs what we're able to do in our programming, in our advocacy. It allows us to contribute to advocacy, to accountability. A lot of the work that we do is really informed by conflict-sensitive and gender-sensitive situation analyses. Sylvia mentioned this as good practice within agencies. Save the Children has one specifically on child recruitment and use, and that complements one that we have more broadly on grave violations, and making sure that we also have really important risk assessments. This is so important to make sure that we are not causing further harm to vulnerable children, that we're acting in a conflict-sensitive manner, that we're not putting ourselves at risk either. What you can see here is, as well is the importance of really emphasising the adherence to international norms and standards and strengthening accountability of perpetrators of recruitment and use and other grave violations, but also accountability to girls and to boys and affected populations. So there's two elements of accountability that we focus on in our work, and I will touch on all of these. Right. As we've heard yesterday and today, from others about the vulnerabilities, particularly of girls to recruitment and use and their experiences of that. And we heard just now about this as well. A lot of what we've heard is very similar to what Save the Children learns through the programming and through the research and evaluations and studies that we do. And I've just highlighted a few key points. So as we've noted, many people have noted already, the vulnerability of girls being recruited for sexual purposes to really, be of, or to meet the needs of fighters. So whether it is as, from a sex slavery perspective, from an early marriage perspective, that's key. And in a recent consultation that Save the Children held in West Africa with girls and boys, this point came out very strongly for girls. And with some girls highlighting that they may actually seek out marriage when they've been recruited, because they also see that as a form of protection, but they recognise that it's a form of control as well. But what we've also seen, particularly in other regions, is that girls may be recruited for other purposes, and similarly to boys, they may be conscripted, and they may have different roles within once they have been recruited into an armed force or armed groups. And Sylvia was mentioning the type of roles that they play. We see similar issues, and similarly, the reasons for what we refer to as coerced recruitment. No recruitment is voluntary at all. So we, as an organisation, we do not use the term voluntary recruitment it doesn't exist. There is always some element of coercion or factors that are contributing to vulnerability. And what we learn from the girls and boys that we work with in the regions where we work is that there's commonality for both boys and girls, particularly around recruitment, family and social pressures, the need for protection. So obviously for girls, that is the need to be protected from physical or emotional or sexual abuse, neglect or exploitation that they are at risk of or experiencing within their homes and their families. And they have felt that it is actually physically safer for them to actually become associated or to join an armed force or armed group to take themselves away from that violence and exploitation. And what we're also seeing, it's come up in West Africa, it's come up in the Middle East, it's come up a lot in Asia as well, is the influence of social media and how that is being used by armed groups to influence, to manipulate, and also to groom, particularly girls, but also boys, into joining, and really using that to glorify the work or the roles and the actions of armed groups. And it was very interesting yesterday seeing the video about the role of social media in Latin America and Colombia as well. I think it's an issue that agencies have been very sensitive and nervous to look at in great detail. And it's interesting that it's coming up quite a lot now. People feel that, yes, we actually need to be doing something about this, and we can and we should. And it's great to see sort of local initiatives that were highlighted yesterday in looking at this issue as well. I think one of the issues, so they're all very similar to what we have already been looking at today and yesterday. One of the things I wanted to highlight, which I don't think has come through so much, is the linkages between grave violations and other serious violations. And one thing, or a couple of things that we're seeing particularly coming through our experience and our research or our studies is linkages obviously between child labour and recruitment, and that's very much for boys, but it's also for girls. But we're seeing increasing connections between, say, trafficking and recruitment, and therefore feeling that we need to look at that from a very particular gender perspective and look at the vulnerabilities of girls as well as boys in that linkage. This is something that's come up in some of our research, but it's also been picked up by UN bodies as well. And similarly, just making a connection between, we already know that there's a connection between conflict and climate insecurity. And we feel as an organisation we need to start looking more closely at the vulnerability to other serious violations, grave violations, and climate insecurity as well. And I think having a particular gender lens on this is really key, and that's also been recognised by UN bodies as well, that we need to, when we're looking at that issue and learning more and responding most appropriately to it, we need to make sure from the beginning that we have a clear, important gender lens, and we can really see the impacts for girls as well as boys. Thinking particularly about these connections between serious violations or broader child protection concerns and grave violations such as recruitment and use of girls and boys, what we found in Save the Children is that we've developed an anticipatory action framework which has come mainly out of our work on other issues such as the impact of climate insecurity. But we recognise making this connection, learning from the work we've already been doing through our centrality of protection work, that we need to be considering vulnerability to particularly recruitment and use of children, but also sexual violence as well, and how we place that within our anticipatory action work so that we know that as a situation deteriorates, we know that we need to be helping to address vulnerability to violations and child protection concerns, particularly recruitment and use of children, and also sexual violence. And I noted the point that was made earlier that we should always expect and assume that girls are being recruited when we know that children are being recruited, but we should also, taking that one step back, we should also recognise that if we see a situation deteriorating from a security perspective, increased presence of armed groups, we should know that recruitment is happening or will happen, and that will involve both girls and boys. You know, it fits with recognised principles around working on conflict-related sexual violence. We know that it's happening, therefore we should be responding to it. And those principles have contributed to the work that we do on anticipatory action and recognising the need to include recruitment and youth within that. Okay. Yes, so the activities that we will include in our anticipatory action work are interventions like case management support, working with communities to identify community-led initiatives to better protect boys and girls. That might include things like particular and appropriate targeted campaigns, not potentially specifically on child recruitment because it's a very sensitive issue, but connected issues, you know, child labour, you know, access to school. It's important to make sure that we're looking at the impact on boys and girls here. We might include social behaviour change activities, again, looking at attitudes within communities, particularly around child recruitment and sexual violence, and how that influences and impacts boys and girls. We also know that we need to be stepping up some of our mental health and psychosocial support work as well. And you can see here where they fit in. So we talk about Save the Children's integrated approach to addressing child recruitment. Having a focus at that community level, we feel that it's important to make sure that there are access to the range of appropriate and required services that are also gender-sensitive services for girls and boys in communities. We've learnt, you know, having worked on this issue for many years, that yes, children absolutely need services as soon as they come out, and as they are coming out of armed forces and armed groups, and our colleague from UNICEF earlier was talking about some of those. But what we've learned is that they need to go into an environment in communities where those services are available as well. And this is really key for prevention as well. You know, we shouldn't be waiting until children are recruited to be thinking about how we address it. Prevention should be coming first. It's appropriate to enable those children, particularly girls, who may exit armed forces, armed groups informally, to return to communities and be able to access the services that they need in a manner where a child's background or experience is not publicly known. And this is so important, we've found, for girls, particularly those who have children themselves. So the importance of the community-based approach and the different types, the multi-sectoral approaches that you've got there. So you've got a lot of work done by social workers. You've got cash voucher assistance. You've got socioeconomic development, and really making sure that we're also looking at how all of that contributes to social cohesion at that community level, and working with local community bodies, community members, making sure boys and girls are within that collaboration, and making sure that capacity building is also included in that. Certainly at that national level, looking at how we can be supporting systems building, particularly in child protection, but also in health, and making sure that as we're doing that, we're building gender-sensitive supports and services as well. And a combination of these services can be highlighted. In the paper, we go into a detail of some programming that we do in West Africa, where capacity building, particularly in support of girls who've experienced sexual violence and case management, is a really key issue. And the programming, I think, is a really good example of where we've looked at the particular experiences and vulnerabilities of girls and boys and their communities and families to say, how can we support that in a way that promotes acceptance, promotes sort of feelings of self-worth, promotes social cohesion, and who else do we need to be working with to do this? So we've got, in a way, the case management support and the MHPSS, which are quite standard in our programming. We work with education colleagues to support return to education in a form that's appropriate to girls and boys. And we also include them in income generating and vocational training activities, along with caregivers. And these activities are informed in consultation with boys and girls and community members, and also through market analyses. I'm mindful of time, so we'll crack on. So this was highlighted already today, but I wanted to mention it also. There are significant challenges of agencies implementing programming. We have the main issues up here. Access is key and is such a challenge in many places where we work. And from a Safe Children perspective, we look at it from how boys and girls can access our services and other services, rather than how we are able to access, or in addition to how we are able to access boys and girls and communities. And I think this is really key. It's been highlighted already today around how particularly girls who've been recruited can often be invisible because they're viewed in a different way. And this is one of the key barriers that we have. Security is also one, and then capacity also. So this funding is the last is a significant challenge also. We've heard already today about the fact that funding is often too short term and may only focus on what the immediate needs are. So long-term support is at risk. And having that focus on being able to address the specific needs of girls and boys can often get lost in this. And as a highlight to this, I'll just go back to the figure. We can see there in 2023, only less than 30% of the funding required for child protection, generally in humanitarian action, was secured. And that's, we know in child protection that we're not good at asking for money. We don't ask for what actually we want. And what we do get, we get very little. So we need to think to ourselves, and also when we're advocating, say to donors, to governments, to the international community, if you're serious about addressing recruitment and use of girls and boys, where are the resources? We need to have the resources to do that, to build the systems and services that are required. If we don't have the funding, if we don't have the resources, we can't build capacity, we can't provide those services. And we can't then, if we're not prepared to provide those services, throw up our arms and say, oh, the situation of recruitment of girls is terrible, what should we do? We know what we need to do. The international community knows what they need to do as well. So moving on from that, we have the legal and normative framework to protect girls and boys. And I won't go into this too much because a lot of people have talked a lot about this already. I did want to highlight, though, some of the key normative frameworks as well, because they are really important. They build on the international legal standards. And we've highlighted a few here, particularly the Paris Principles and Commitments. So the Paris Commitments are political commitments that member states sign up to, stating that they will work to prevent the recruitment of girls and boys and support, if children are recruited, that they will support their sustained reintegration. And so far we have about 170, so more than half of the UN General Assembly have signed those commitments, and we have the principles which are guidance for that. But what we are finding is the lack of implementation. There's no point in saying, and I think it was highlighted earlier, laws have been passed, conventions have been signed, the Paris Principles have been endorsed. That's not enough. We need to be implementing, and states have an important commitment and obligation to do that. Moving on from, sorry, before I go onto that, just thinking of some of the advocacy work that we do around this. I was mentioning that Save the Children co-chairs the Paris Principles Steering Group, and through that group we have comprehensive handbook on how to address child recruitment. Within that, there's a strong focus on what is required to support girls who are vulnerable to recruitment and who have experienced child recruitment. We have advocacy aids that detail states' obligations, what is required, making sure that they are paying attention to the needs and respecting the rights and needs of girls as well as boys. And we're currently working on an implementation note for the Paris commitments as well. So with these tools and with the advocacy that we do with other colleagues from the Paris Principles Steering Group, including UNICEF, including the government of France, etc., there's a lot of advocacy that we have been doing, but we need to continue doing to make sure that child recruitment and the situation of girls in particular is addressed. So moving on, I'm mindful of time, I'm not too sure how much time we've got left, but accountability. This has come up a bit, I think UNICEF were talking about it before. A key political accountability tool to address recruitment and use of children, including girls, is the UN-led monitoring and reporting mechanism. And you can see here what the objective of the mechanism is. It's a key accountability tool which enables engagement, provides information or enables the mechanism to gather information on grave violations that is also gender disaggregated. So it talks about the number of girls who are affected, the number of boys affected. We're able to use that information, or the UN is able to use that information to engage parties to conflict, whether they be states, whether they be armed groups, to agree actions to prevent and to violations like child recruitment and to end them as well. So this is where the release and reintegration of children can also be negotiated and arranged, or through the use of handover protocols. And it is a key tool because when that information is available publicly once a year through the annual report of the UN Secretary General, the names of the armed groups and armed forces in the countries where recruitment is happening and where we are able to collect this information and the MRM is established, that is, people refer to it as a naming and shaming tool. And it can be very powerful. People don't want to be on that list. So it enables us to say, okay, you don't want to be there. What steps are you prepared to take to address recruitment and use of children? How are you treating girls who are vulnerable to recruitment and other serious grave violations? What are you doing for boys as well? And Save the Children has been engaging in the MRM since its establishment in 2005, and I think there are about 14 to 15 countries where we're working, where we are supporting it or feeding information into it. So I mentioned at the beginning about the importance of monitoring and reporting of grave and other serious violations in the work that we do in the countries that we work in, and that information we're able to share in the appropriate manner, completely anonymized information, but still gender disaggregated. We're able to share that, to contribute to the MRM, and we're also, in some places, able to work with the UN in their engagement with parties to conflict. We're able to encourage more effort to make sure that information is gender disaggregated, that there is good attention on the situation of girls as well as the situation of boys. I'm just going to move past some of these. There. So there's challenges for the MRM that we've found in our work. Security and access obviously is a key thing. But one of the things I wanted to highlight is there's often criticism that information on the situation of girls, particularly in relation to recruitment, but other grave violations, sexual violence, for example, or abduction, that information is really very poor, very, very low. And people have talked already over the past couple of days about the invisibilization of girls. And we criticise the UN and the report that comes out every year. So, we can't really see what, the situation of girls. As a humanitarian agency, Save the Children does have a responsibility to strengthen the data that is available. We find that the fewer agencies that are engaging in the MRM, the poorer the data. We're relying on few people to get data, to verify it. We can't complain if the quality of the data is poor, that gender disaggregation isn't there, or is only partial, and therefore we can't see the true situation of girls when there are very few people collecting the information. So the more agencies, not just in child protection, but in other sectors as well. The grave violations look at other sectors too. So the more agencies who are involved in monitoring and reporting and can share that information to the UN to be verified, the better data that we have and the clearer picture that we will have on the situation of girls who are vulnerable to recruitment or who have been recruited and used. And we can use that data to engage parties to conflict and say, what are you doing about girls who are recruited? They have the right to be released. You have the responsibility, not and the obligation, not to be recruiting them in the first place. So just here we've got requirements of an effective monitoring and reporting mechanism that you can see there. I'm just moving through. That's our engagement of that. And when we've looked at our own work on this, we've thought, how can we improve? So really trying to systematise the monitoring and reporting that we do in key countries, and this is why we have our centrality of protection policy, really looking at how we can connect at that local level. What can we be doing with communities to improve information or the access to information that they know? So the relationship that we have with communities we see is really key, not just to be able to get a better sense of what's happening and the vulnerability of girls and the vulnerability of boys, but also how can we work with them to improve local protection initiatives. particularly those that may support girls. Other promising practices that we found are important for us, this collaboration with UNICEF. It's been mentioned several times already today how important collaboration is with UNICEF, with other organisations, and that's key. You know, how can we benefit from the expertise and experience that we have across the range of agencies that are available? How can we be supporting each other's work? Also making sure that our materials are child-friendly, speak to girls as well as speaking to boys. There's something that is understood, and accepted at a community level as well. So moving on, we also work on legal accountability. And we heard yesterday about the work of the International Criminal Court. So Save the Children does not, in our legal accountability work, we don't work on specific contexts, specific cases, but we do advocate on the improvement of child-sensitive legal accountability mechanisms. And one of the main instruments that we've used in doing this, when we were doing research about 5-6 years ago, and we really understood that there's such a poor focus on and respect of child rights within legal accountability. We saw yesterday about some of the cases that have gone through the International Criminal Court in relation to child recruitment and sexual violence, and the focus within that on girls. That has improved, but it's still very poor. And a few years ago, we published a key report, Advancing Justice for Children, and you can see here some of the key challenges and deficits and weaknesses that were identified through that research. So, and when I looked at this report, was really trying to pull out points that were specific to girls. So really noticing that there's a cultural and attitudinal barrier to addressing crimes and violations against children, but particularly girls. As I mentioned, this invisibilization, and really not recognizing children as individuals, as people, as those who have rights that should be protected, which is astounding, really. But also recognising that there's a lack of this technical capacity within legal accountability mechanisms that will make sure that the rights and needs, particularly of girls, but also of boys, are actually respected and paid attention to, so that there is proper justice for those girls and boys for crimes that have been committed against them. One of the other things that we've been doing, as well as the advocacy, we've developed some training, online training, on child-focused accountability. And I think in people's bags, they have a little flash drive from Save the Children, and I think there's a link to that training, online training, on that flash disk. So, you're welcome to have a look at that and do the training yourself. In response to the report that we did, there has been positive movement by the ICC, or following. I'm not too sure whether it's in response or certainly since the report first came out. The ICC have recognised the importance and the need to have a better gender-sensitive lens to the work that they've done. And this can be seen in their 2023 policy on children. It recognises how the impact of crimes can vary according to age and gender, and this is particularly important for girls. And it acknowledges the gender dimensions of crimes that particularly affect girls. So the policy calls for proactive investigation and prosecution of such gender-based crimes, and calls for acknowledgement of the distinct experience of girls when seeking justice under the Rome Statute. So that's really important. And therefore, how can we as an organisation, how can child protection, child rights agencies be supporting that as well? So having very quickly gone through the 3 elements of work that Save the Children does, I was thinking, what for us is essential to addressing recruitment and use of children, particularly of girls. And for me, a lot of it comes down to this accountability point that we were talking about earlier. So the respect of child rights within international and national laws and standards, and making sure that they are gender sensitive and they truly recognise the specific needs and rights of girls as well as boys. Accountability of perpetrators to account for crimes that they commit against girls and against boys. And accountability of the international community, of states, of us, to girls and boys, working, building from the national legal frameworks. If you've got a national child protection law, that requires you to have a child protection system, to have an education system, to have services and supports that protect children at all levels. That is the accountability to children, and without those, we will be seeing increased numbers of girls and boys who are recruited and used by armed forces and armed groups. So for us as an organisation, those are the 3 elements that we work on. We see that not one or not a couple of them, but across all 3, those are that's the focus of the work that we do on child recruitment, and we will be continuing to do that as well. So I'll leave it there. I think there were a couple of slides that didn't get saved, but we'll put them on there so people can have a look later. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Christine. I will give now the word to Ezequiel Efes, because I think you have told us some things that he will focus on, and maybe this evening we can speak about all of those topics you have spoken about, and all of the things that you think that should ameliorate.